So today's seminar, we're lucky to have Dr. Destiny Knock, who's an assistant professor in the Energy and Public Policy group, Engineering, and Public Policy group at Carnegie Mellon University, where she has been doing some really interesting work on the topic of energy justice and equitable energy transitions, which are at the core of the new Biden administration's goals for their infrastructure transition and moving towards a cleaner energy sector. So Destiny is going to give us a talk today entitled The Energy Equity Gap, Unveiling Hidden Energy Poverty. And we're really lucky to have her. Welcome, Destiny, and take it away when you're ready.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. So today I am going to be focused on presenting you all a new method that we have been developing for identifying who is hidden in energy poverty. So of course, we have been really ingrained in reaching the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 7 to ensure access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable modern energy for all. And when we're thinking about electricity access, in my group, we like to quantify this in terms of 5 facets. So first is affordability. Can you actually pay for the electricity that you want to use? Then there's the reliability. A lot of people kind of zone in on this when we're thinking about the Texas disaster. Is it actually there when you need it to be there? The quantity is how many appliances you can connect in your household. The quality is when you do connect those appliances, are they going to overheat, right? Or is it going to be at the proper frequency? And then of course, last but not least is the supply, looking at that generation side. Do you have an electricity connection in your home, in your neighborhood? And do you have the energy technologies that you need to supply the community with as much demand as they have? So in my group, we are really focused on using decision analysis to inform sustainable transitions. And typically when people hear sustainable transitions, they think of those 3 pillars, right? The economic, the environmental, and the social, where we like to think of it as this triangle where we have the development and transition in that bottom corner. So that's when we are going to think of the economics, but also that technological innovation and technology change. We have environmental sustainability, of course. We want to reduce our greenhouse gas emission, air pollution emissions, as well as increase our water quality. And then there's equality at the top. And the big thing that we're focused on in my group are the trade-offs between the different points of this pyramid and trying to understand where we actually land between these 3. So let's just make sure we're all on the same page about definition. So in terms of equality concerns, at the very high level, there's the macro scale. So that's looking at like global level extraction of materials and global waste streams. Then we have the mesoscale, which are national issues, typically thinking about unequal access to renewable technologies, air pollution effects, job distribution, as well as different electricity prices, depending on where you're living. And then there's the microscale, which are looking at local environmental impacts and exclusion of rural areas from benefits, as well as your ability to heat or cool your home. So in this talk, we're going to be focused on the microscale when we're looking at equality and equity issues. And we're going to leave the meso and the macro scale for future work. One thing that I do want to premise about this talk is I know that it's virtual and you guys may have been expecting to sit here and have to do nothing, but there is an interactive portion. So please, wake up at your computers and get ready because the interactive portion is happening right now. So the first thing that I'm asking you is, what do you think of when you hear the word energy poverty? So if you click on the link that I just posted in the chat to all panelists, then you should come to, this interactive portion here. And I see a bunch of anonymous animals showing up. And on slide 2, you're going to see what's the biggest challenge for energy or electricity poverty. And you should be able to drag an X to your answer. Everybody should be able to edit at the same exact time. And if you can't edit, please let us know. Okay, so we have one person who's, okay, there we go. So let's see, we have most people appearing to be in these top 2 quadrants, that inability to afford electricity. And we also have a couple of people looking at no electricity access. So that's supply side. And then we have one person in the middle who cannot make up their mind between all four. And then we have one person on the side of the inability to cool or heat their home. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. Dun, dun, dun. So energy poverty in the US, I'm actually not surprised that most people put that financial affordability as the biggest challenge for energy poverty, because that is what has dominated the literature in the US. This is a map of energy burden at the county level for the US, where the lightest color is representing those that spend less than 6% of their annual income meeting their energy bills, and the darkest part of this map is representing those that spend more than 19% meeting their energy bills. And what we know about energy poverty is that energy burden, so the percent that you spend on meeting your energy bills, that's really the core side of energy poverty, because you actually have to have energy in your region to do that. Then if we zoom out a little bit, we go to energy insecurity, which is really that reliability and outage risk. It's, is it there when you need it? And do you actually feel like you can use it if you have it in your home? And then larger, the largest bubble is energy poverty. So that's the supply concerns plus insecurity plus energy burden. And so when we're looking at how we currently measure energy poverty, there is this graph is the primary versus secondary metrics. So primary metrics are those that are based on your actual data and your actual consumption. Secondary metrics are going to be when they're using secondary measures. That's typically national level measures or county level measures. And then there's the absolute, do you fall above or below a threshold? And then the relative is how do you compare with your neighbors? So the traditional energy poverty metric or energy burden is going to be a primary absolute metric. It's are you spending more than 6% of your income or not? And what all of these measures are missing is people's consumption and behavior, because we do know that people may adapt their behavior to adjust their energy bills. So now the next part of this interactive portion is, have you ever adapted your behavior to reduce financial strain? So if we go to slide 3 of this interactive portion, then the question is, in the winter, have you ever kept your house colder than you would have liked to save money? So you have a yes or a no, and then we would like to know how often you do this if you did say yes. So all the time, sometimes, or rarely. Okay, so some anonymous animals. Come on slide 2. You're missing the party on slide 3. You're falling behind. And 1, you're super behind, Mr. Anonymous Penguin or Mrs. Anonymous Penguin, gender neutral anonymous penguin. Please join us on slide 3. And I saw somebody trying to skip ahead. Don't do that. That ruins the interactive parts. So we see a lot of people in this yes side. We got 2 people who are no, so they're super comfortable in your home. You guys are the people that we aspire to be, those 2 no's. And we see that there's only 1 person who's done this all of the time, and pretty evenly split between the sometimes and the rarely. So for them, let's just make sure we indulge the no's. So let's consider 2 households. Household number 1 has an income of $30,000. Maybe some of the PhD students, if they're in the audience, are feeling like this might reflect them. They spend 5% of their disposable income on meeting their energy needs. So under the energy burden threshold of a 10% bar, they are actually defined as not energy poor. Whereas this other household 2, has an income of $100,000 a year. They also spend 5% of their disposable income on meeting their energy needs, and they are also defined as not energy poor. So what we know is that the traditional energy poverty measure or energy burden, which is based on income, does miss people's behavior and people's tendency to reduce their energy consumption. So those of you in the audience that responded, yes, I have kept my whole house a lot colder in the winter than I would have liked to, and I feel like I do this all the time or most of the time, you may have actually been experiencing a form of energy poverty, but that's something that we have not been recognizing traditionally in our analysis. So our goal is to recognize those people, is to recognize everybody that limits their behavior, and we want to integrate this behavior into energy poverty analysis. And what we are doing is quantifying the energy limiting behavior of households as a new measure. And we're going to look at this within regions because we want to look at like how you're doing compared to like how your neighbor's doing. And in case you're wondering where that measure is falling on our, our axes here, the energy equity gap is going to be a relative primary measure with a hint of absoluteness in there, which we'll explain a little bit further. Our study region is Arizona in the United States. We have collected utility data from a utility company in Phoenix, Arizona. So one thing to keep in mind is that the climate is very long, extremely hot summers, very mild winters. So what we're actually going to do is for our energy poverty analysis, we're going to start with air conditioning consumption and energy usage. Our research process. First, we start with the household level utility data straight from the company. We're going to match this with a household level demographic survey. This includes information about their income, their racial identification or their ethnic identification, where they live, the type of house they are in. So that gives us information about how old the house is, the type of appliances they use, and other information there, like whether it's a single family home, whether they're a renter or an owner. We also collect local temperature data. So this is going to be outdoor temperature data. And we use this to calculate the household inflection temperature, which I'll explain in the next slide. And this all feeds into our energy equity gap calculation for the year. So the question on everybody's minds, the household inflection temperature, what exactly is it? Well, it's the temperature at which we would say that a household is going to shift from their heating to their cooling. So this graph here is showing you the daily mean outdoor temperature on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we have the daily electricity consumption in kilowatt hours. This graph is representing one household for 1 year. So each blue dot represents 1 day of the year. So please keep in mind that we actually have 6,000 of these graphs in our analysis, just showing you one here for the convenience and to not overwhelm you guys. So what we do is we can see that this is forming a U-shaped curve because as you are moving into the winter, you're going to increase that energy consumption for your heating system. Then you're kind of going to minimize it out, right? Now it's like warm enough or cool enough. You're going to open your windows, right? You're not going to have turned on your AC yet. And then all of a sudden we start to see this ramp up in terms of like using your AC as you're moving deeper into the summer. So this minimum point here is what we're defining as the inflection temperature. And we just are saying that the inflection temperature is the first temperature at which a household would be willing to turn on their air conditioning unit. And so here the inflection temperature is going to be 69 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that these are daily mean temperatures. So the maximum temperature for that day is actually going to be a lot hotter than 69 degrees because this is the mean for the day. And our hypothesis here is that lower income households are going to have higher inflection temperatures because they are going to endure hotter temperatures in order to save money on cooling. Our methodology is based on using a regression analysis to find that black line for that inflection temperature and define that minimum point. We feed into the regression analysis, we're going to feed in the daily outdoor temperature, the electricity price for that customer. The utility company does provide us with the prices that each of the different customers pays, whether it's a weekend or a holiday. And then we have fixed effects for the day of the week and the month of the year. So on this box plot, on the x-axis, we have the different income groups where 1 is the lowest income group. That's those that make less than $15,000 a year. 8 is the highest income group, those that make $150,000 or more a year. And then on the y-axis, we have the inflection temperatures. So again, we're only looking at those minimum points for the different households. And the energy equity gap is calculated as the maximum of the median inflection temperatures subtracted from the minimum of the median inflection temperatures. And here, those occur in the highest and the lowest income groups. And so we see the energy equity gap for 2015 is actually 6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that actually, can actually tell us like, well, if one high income household is turning on their AC unit at about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, that means a low income household may be waiting until it's actually 76 degrees Fahrenheit outside. And one other thing that we know is that this gap could actually be a lot wider than our analysis is showing, because we know that higher income households typically live in very shaded areas. They have very energy efficient windows and insulation. So the indoor temperature inside the home may actually feel a lot cooler than the outdoor temperature. Also in the lower income groups, they have typically more concrete. They live in more high-rise buildings, and so they're also going to be more likely to have that urban heat islanding effect. So we looked at this across 4 years of our study, and again, the y-axis is the inflection temperatures, and the x-axis is going to be the different years in this graph. The pink line is the highest income group, and the gray line is the lowest income group, and then we just have written the energy equity gap at the top of each of these points. And so we see that for all of the years in our analysis, the energy equity gap varies between 4.7 degrees Fahrenheit and 7.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And one of the biggest things that we notice is that the change in the energy equity gap is really about this elasticity of demand in that lowest income group, that gray line at the top. And so they are the ones that are really shifting their behavior. Now, one of the things that we have noticed is that, this is following price increases as well as increases in the number of cooling degree days. So as we are moving into energy transition, those price increases can severely impact people's willingness to use electricity consumption, specifically in that low income group. Whereas over time, the highest income group, which we're using as our baseline, is lowering their inflection temperatures over time, which means that they're actually starting to use those AC units earlier in the year. So that's also one thing to keep in mind, is that the low income group is actually not able to follow the trends of the high income group or the highest 2 income groups, but they're actually diverging from that, which is causing the gap to widen. One question that has been posed in our for our analysis is, is this a preference or is this inequality? So what we have done here is we've separated the inflection temperatures by ethnic group, where we have the green dotted line is the Hispanic population, the yellow solid line is the Asian population, the brown line is the base case, the green solid line is the white population, and the black dotted line is the Black population. And we see that, I'll just take the Black population, it has the highest inflection temperatures over time. And if we look at the energy equity gap by ethnic group, we actually see differing trends across these different groups. So again, the energy equity gap is going to be calculated by subtracting the maximum and minimum inflection temperatures across all the income groups within the ethnic group. So if we stick with looking at the Black population, we see that they start off at about 6-degree difference between those income groups. And then it kind of lessens over time, meaning everybody is either becoming equally worse off or equally better off. And then the gap starts to widen over time again. So again, the big question here is this, are these high inflection temperatures and is that lowering gap a preference, or is it representing an inequality? So when we're looking at the preferences, I just wanted to give you guys a flavor of, how our demographics are distributed across the survey that we received for the different customers. And we see that the white population is the largest population in our group. Asian is the yellow bars, the blue bars are Hispanic, and the green bars are the Black population. And then the gray bars at the bottom are other. So when we're looking at the Black and the Hispanic population here, what we would predict is that if it was just a preference, the vertical distribution across these graphs would be very narrow. But what we see here is a very wide vertical distribution in the Black population, and actually that gray line, the lowest income group, is actually in the middle of these lines. And so what we have hypothesized is that the lowest income group within the Black population are receiving energy subsidies and energy rebates, policy incentives potentially. And so they're actually able to lower their inflection temperatures and use more energy consumption over time. Whereas the second lowest income group has not qualified for those subsidies, especially since subsidies are typically based on the amount of the degree to which you're below the federal poverty line. So because it's a very wide vertical distribution, we are saying that this is representing an inequality, and one reason why we may need to consider including more than just the lowest income group within our energy subsidies. If we look at the Hispanic population now, we see that there's actually a very tight vertical distribution across all income groups except for the lowest income group. And so here, potentially they have not taken advantage of those subsidies, or maybe there is a lack of infrastructure investment here by this Hispanic population in the lowest income group. And so while we see a tight vertical distribution in the groups 2 through 8, we do recognize that this lower income group is experiencing some form of inequality compared to their counterparts. We also have looked at the age groups within our analysis, and we see that if we just look at the young and the older population, we can see that the 25 to 35-year-olds, it does have a good spread, but it's not as wide as we saw in the Black population. And then in the 75-year-old case, we see a very tight vertical distribution in 2015, and all of a sudden it starts to widen between 2016 and 2017. We did see temperatures rise within the Phoenix region during these 2 years, and so that could represent an inability to adapt to climate change. But then the gap started to narrow, the inflection temperature started to narrow again. So we are noticing, one thing to take away from this is that we notice a wider inequality in the ethnic groups as opposed to the aged groups. And so that could be a takeaway for policymakers to actually investigate, how they are distributing those policies and to potentially target different members of demographic groups. A part of our ongoing work is to understand what has caused the energy equity gap to shrink and then widen. Some of the things that we have been investigating are the maximum average monthly temperature, the different cooling degree days, the residential electricity price, and then how that changes the energy equity gap. So one thing that we have noticed is that an increase in the cooling degree days, so a 3.6 degree increase from year 1 to year 2, and a 2.4% increase in the residential electricity price from year 1 to year 2 actually led to a 10% increase in our energy equity gap from year 1 to year 2. And the reason that we have to look at the following year for the energy equity gap is because the way that we calculate the equity gap, it requires a year's worth of data. And so it would take a year for us to see any behavior changes in the energy equity gap from a disparity. And we also see that we also see that a 2.5 degree increase in the cooling degrees combined with a 2.7 degree increase in the electricity price also led to a 44.2% increase in the energy equity gap. So that is one reason why we believe that the cooling degree day and residential electricity price changes are what has been causing this energy equity gap to widen. So I started this whole presentation by telling you that we may have been getting our energy poverty calculations wrong by using the traditional energy poverty measure based on income, or energy burden as some people call it. So we can actually calculate the traditional energy poverty metric with our same data set. So no extra data has been required to calculate this. And here on the x-axis, we have like the log scale for the energy burden, and the 10% threshold has been highlighted by this red dotted line. The number of households is along the y-axis, and the percent of people who are defined as energy poor under the traditional energy poverty metric are highlighted at the top. So what we see is that it's 2.7% of the population in 2015. It starts to get better. And then all of a sudden it starts to get worse. And in 2018, it seems like we are back exactly where we started. So one big takeaway here is that our equity gap actually showed like a narrowing and then a widening, and it got worse. And we were actually able to see what was causing it to get worse. Whereas this threshold measure, it pretty much just tells you like how many people are above or below, but doesn't actually hint at what's causing them to jump above or below that threshold. So for our energy equity gap, one of our proposals for how it can inform policy is to think of a tier-based aid system based on the household inflection temperatures. We have the median inflection temperature of the highest income group to 2 times the equity gap above that median. We would say it's a low risk zone. Now, if we look 2 times the equity gap above the median of the highest income group, which is our baseline, to 78 degrees Fahrenheit for the average outdoor temperature, we would say that that's our first tier, potentially energy insecurity. And the reason that we use the 78 degree Fahrenheit threshold is because we read a report where government buildings had recommended keeping their thermostats at 78 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you are keeping your thermostat at 78 degrees Fahrenheit, then in theory, when the average temperature is above that, meaning that you're most likely reaching temperatures of like 80, 85, potentially 90, you should be cooling your home in order to reduce your risk of heat-related illness and heat-related death. And so then above 78 degrees Fahrenheit, if you're waiting longer than that to turn on your AC unit, you might even turn it on just to turn it on, then we would define that household as energy poor. So coming up to another interactive portion backed by popular demand, how many households do you believe overlapped between the traditional based energy poverty metric and our tier 2? So what I should tell you is that if we're looking at 2015, under the traditional energy poverty measure, there was 141 households defined as energy poor. And then under our tier-based aid system in our second tier, we had 86 households defined as energy poor. And so the question here is, out of that 141 and 86, how many households do you believe overlapped and were defined as energy poor under both measures? So that would be slide 4. Okay, so it seems like most people are believing that it's between 25 to the 50 range. We have some people up here thinking it's closer to 86, meaning that if that our measure might not be worth that much if we're actually finding everybody who, oh, so let me move the bar. Dun, dun, dun. If we're defining everybody, finding the same exact people. So, whoops. Okay. So, bum, 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 the drum is rolling. Everybody wants to know the answer. Only 3. So in our 2015 analysis, we had 4,577 households. And out of that, 141 defined in the TEP measure and the 86 defined in our second tier, only 3 households were defined as energy poor under both measures. So that is why we are saying that our measure represents a hidden form of energy poverty, because those 83 households would have been left out of all energy subsidies and energy rebates and energy poverty alleviation efforts. So as we are moving forward, some of the policy implications are that we need to identify households that are experiencing more than one type of energy poverty. Yes, there is financial poverty. We are not saying that that doesn't matter. We do not actually advocate for that. We want to make sure that we are addressing the compounding effects of poverty, because we do know that people are very smart. They're very financially savvy. And if you can make sure that you're not going to go into debt, meeting your energy, covering your energy bills, then you are going to wear those jackets, wear, 3 layers of socks, keep your thermostat super low or in the winter or super high in the summer. But that could also be potentially putting yourself at a heat-related or cold-related risk of illness. So one of the big takeaways is that the energy equity gap captures relative energy equity among a population using the same information that is required to calculate that energy burden or traditional energy poverty metric. And so again, this is a complementary analysis that we believe can help aid in understanding the how other forms of energy poverty are hidden when we only focus on income-based measures. As a part of our future work, we are planning to investigate how COVID-19 has impacted people's energy use. We are looking at applying the energy equity gap calculation to data from 2019 to 2020, as well as we have conducted a choice experiment to elicit the willingness to pay for indoor comfort and cooling. And then we are in talks with hopefully going to be able to look at other regions, potentially regions that experience deeper freezes, especially more extreme weather events in the winter, to look at the energy equity gap in both the summer and the winter. So if you leave with nothing else from this presentation, I hope that you understand that there are multiple forms of energy poverty that need to be addressed. It's not just about financial poverty, but also about understanding who feels like they actually can't even afford to turn on their energy systems. So thank you everyone for listening and participating.
Well, thank you very much, Destiny. And as everybody knows, I think Steve Davis had to leave early, so I am going to take over the job of moderating. There's already you've already provoked a number of questions, and I got to say, this works out. Your presentation is really sort of a perfect fit with other presentations that we've had in this series over the past few months, and I'm sure there are lots of interest. But there's several questions about the data itself, and maybe I don't know if you want to look at those, or I can sort of paraphrase for you. But let's just go through them very quickly. So the first question is did your Arizona study incorporate any information about rate plans and the potential impact of different rate plans on household decisions?
So we did include rate plans by including that electricity price that they had to pay at different hours of the year, and including that in our regression analysis. But we, I guess, like, because we actually included that in the regression to find our minimum, then I'm not exactly, like, we did not compare like within a specific income group and like separated people based on their plans. We actually haven't looked at like how that has specifically impacted their consumption. We do know that there is a very wide range in this inflection temperature here. Now, one hypothesis for these very low temperatures is that one thing we cannot control for is when people are actually not in their home. So, you know, if people are taking vacations, if they have a secondary home, that's something that we're not able to control for in our data. We don't actually know about that. And so I think hopefully that answers the question about the rate plans, but we do have information on the price that people are paying throughout the day, but we have not investigated within the income group, like how does that impact the behavior, the specific rate plan.
And I guess a related question, I don't know if this sort of comes from this, is that in a variety of cases, a lot of the most disadvantaged communities are renters, and in some situations they have very little control or no control over that, especially if the landlord covers the costs of HVAC. They don't have any control over setting the temperature themselves. Was that something that was factored into your research?
So that was not factored into our research. So we do not, like, we can identify who's a renter and who's an owner of the house, but we do not know who's a renter and who has a landlord controlled thermostat. Right. So like that is not something that we were privy to in terms of information. And so we would actually be making a guess, because we also know that not all renters have landlord controlled thermostats.
Right, exactly, and there may be an important distinction. Another question that's come up is there a noticeable influence related to the installation of solar panels on homes? The idea is that the cost of energy is cheaper for some consumers, and therefore they may be, you know, more willing to use it. I suppose that might suggest that wealthier consumers might have solar energy as well, allowing them to you know, use air conditioning earlier and so on.
Right. So again, like, we don't actually have information about who has a solar panel or not. Now, I'm sure that we could potentially look at that, like using like a machine learning model to see, what, like, I guess looking at their differences in maximum and minimum total electricity use for the household, and given different days, if we had like looked at like, solar radiation potentially, we could probably estimate like, do they even have a solar panel or not? But again, like that's not something that we actually had from our data of just the data that we were given was household level electricity use at the hourly level. And we were given like some demographic information about, the income level of the home, the race, where they lived, and the household age, and some of their appliances within the home. But we did not know if people had different solar panels. Now that being said, yes, I do believe that having solar panels on the home could also help the wealthier homes use energy a lot earlier because it is a lot cheaper. And also one thing that will impact are those slopes of that inflection temperature graph. So right now, what we have focused on is actually this minimum point, but these slopes are also very important for your ability to adapt to climate change. Because if you do not have a household level air conditioning unit and you only have like fans in your home, then we know this is going to be a very flat curve and you're not going to be able to reach that desired indoor temperature even when you do start cooling. So potentially like a solar panel could help flatten that curve, but also, it could help flatten the curve from the utilities perspective because they're not supplying you with as much electricity.
I suspect there's some interesting questions raised, given your research in relationship to the U.S. plan to accelerate decarbonization, which, there's a strong focus on social justice and equity in that discussion and in the current administration's plans. But there's no doubt that things like the early adoption of solar energy by wealthier communities and wealthier households might actually increase the energy equity gap as we go through the transition. But let me get through a couple of the other questions. Another question is, were there weather differences, hotter summers and so on, and price differences over the course of the 5 years of your study?
Yes, there were. So over the 5 years of our study, we did see the electricity price increase over time. Now it did decrease from year 3 to year 4, but we didn't have year 5 data in order to calculate how that impacted the energy equity gap to see if it lowered or widened. And then the cooling degree days required. So the number of days at which you would be required to like cool your home, we did see an increase in that over time as well. And so we saw that when those increase in the following year, we saw the energy equity gap increase.
I'm going to guess that this next question, your answer is that you didn't have that data, but I'll ask it anyways because it may be important to think about. And that is, did you survey households about family influences on behavior? Some families, for example, and this I guess relates to the educational dimension where certain family members might encourage the rest of the family to, not use air conditioning as early or what have you. So did you look at sort of the family dimensions of behavioral sort of decision making?
So no, we did not. So we did not actually deploy the survey. The survey came directly from the utility company. And so it was information that they had already collected. And in order to get that information, we were not allowed to resurvey their customers. We did, in our original regression analysis, we did include like family size to see if that had impacted provided a better prediction of like that minimum point for the family, but we did not find any statistical significance in terms of household size as a predictor for electricity usage.
Now another question raised is at higher temperatures, it seems that there's a broader distribution among groups in your study, which would seem to be indicative of higher entropy, which could be a measure of sociological collapse. Are there efforts to use your methodologies to understand climate change driven migration, i.e., people leaving because it's getting too hot to stay?
So we have not done that. What we are hoping to do is, well, what we're currently doing is looking like at a future analysis just to understand under different climate change scenarios where we could be experiencing greater levels of heat waves or, even just higher temperatures, how might this energy equity gap either shrink or widen over time? And how is that going to impact energy poverty and energy burden over time? But we have not investigated migration patterns of people. We also have only looked at the Phoenix, Arizona metropolitan area. So I think that would also require us to look at like a much broader swath of Arizona and in the US, which is one of the reasons why we're hoping to look at multiple cities across the US as well as multiple regions across the United States. But this was our first analysis. I mean, the paper was just submitted to a journal 2 weeks ago. So you guys are getting it hot off the presses. The reviewers haven't even finished ripping it apart yet.
And so I'm going to encourage our various participants to raise more questions. And while people are thinking about that, let me ask you a question, and that is, it has to do with the sort of our national strategy to decarbonize, which one of the issues that I think has emerged is that people aren't quite sure. They want it to be just from an environmental perspective, so they want to integrate this into the transition. Do you have any, based on the work that this study, but on your broader body of work, do you have suggestions about ways in which we could make the transition to net zero more equitable?
Yeah, so in terms of transitioning to a more equitable future, I think that one of the big things that comes to mind is demand response, right? I've heard of that a ton in terms of when we have this like really high, this high level of renewables, then we need to make sure that we have households signed up, and we're going to go to these households that are super comfortable, they're super wealthy, we're going to put in a smart thermostat, and we are going to make them slightly more uncomfortable when we need to reduce energy consumption, right? So when we don't have enough on the grid. But one of the things that I hope that policymakers take away and energy transition analysis take away is that there are a lot of households that are actually very uncomfortable, right? They're not able to consume as much energy as they would like. And so these households should actually be the prime candidates for smart thermostats, for utility programs to say, hey, there are going to be times in 100% renewable energy future when we're going to have tons of wind curtailment, tons of solar curtailment, because we have to overbuild our capacity in order to make sure we can cover everybody during normal times. And so during those times of wind curtailment or solar curtailment, what we could do is actually think about creating programs where we actually send that energy to people who are very uncomfortable and cool their temperatures in the summer or raise their temperatures in the winter in order to make them actually have a more comfortable indoor environment. So that's one, if anybody would like to collaborate on demand response analysis in terms of the energy equity implications, that's something that I am very interested in. Looking forward, because I do believe that in a net zero energy transition, if we want to address energy poverty, I mean, one way to do that is by looking at rebates and providing people with financial incentives. Another way to do that is to actually say, hey, this is the base level of energy, or this is the base level indoor temperature that you should be keeping at your house in order to protect yourself from a heat wave, from a deep freeze, and you're not using that, but we have all this extra supply that we were going to send to some storage facility for later, but hey, let's send it to your house instead if you sign up for this program.
So one of the things that in the social sciences is getting a lot of attention, it has for some time, is the potential value of sort of bringing in these people who are disadvantaged, who are on the wrong side of the energy equity gap, and asking them, how do you see this problem, and how are you coping with it, and what would you see as priorities? Do you have any plans to sort of take your research and maybe go into the field and ask, and maybe have some focus groups with people who are experiencing energy poverty, and asking them how this resonates with their experiences, and whether they recognize your argument in terms of what they are living through, or whether there are ways they would suggest you adjust it and so on?
So I currently don't have plans to go out into the field now. I will say that COVID made me a little bit nervous about going into the field. Before COVID happened, we went to Ghana to understand how local objectives for energy transition within the country diverged from international objectives for energy planning in sub-Saharan Africa. So that is like going into the field and talking with actual people and actual community leaders and even just like residents is something that I do have interest in. One of the things that I have been kind of advocating for is with the utility companies, because they are ones that actually have a lot of those programs already, but there is this sometimes like resistance to sign up. Sometimes people don't know about them. And then there's also this challenge of like, who do we identify that can actually qualify for these subsidies, for these rebates? And so while I haven't looked at the community scale at this point with this analysis, what I have done is I have presented to multiple utility companies to actually say like, you know, hey, I know that you guys have these programs, and they even say that sometimes there's money left over because not everybody who can qualify signs up. And so, you know, like maybe if we use this data to actually identify who's not using their energy consumption, that could also be another avenue that you open up for homes that are not consuming as much as you would expect them to. And so, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please. I didn't realize you went.
I was going to just say, like, one thing that I'm hoping for this work in terms of policy is that we can have these different pillars of potential alleviation efforts based on your own demographics and what we know about you. So if you're a renter, we can say, okay, you fall into this bucket and you're going to qualify for, you know, the rebate for potentially like the demand response. If your landlord, we're going to try to get your landlord to put in a smart thermostat, and maybe we know the landlord has like tons of homes and we're going to try to incentivize them to do that. So because you're a renter, we're going to have to put you in the bucket where we have to work with your landlord and work with you. Now, if you're a homeowner, right now you're going to fall into a different bucket, right? And we're going to try to incentivize you to like adopt that energy efficient air conditioning unit. And we're going to try to, you know, get you to adopt all the infrastructure that you need, but also like, you know, it's about getting you to adopt your smart thermostat and like then working with you on that. And so I really do think that by identifying the compounding effects of poverty, we could potentially have these different policy streams based on the things that you are and are not able to change within your home based on your status.
You know, we do a lot of work on very, very fine resolution modeling of flood risk. And we use tons of data. We use, you know, remote sensing data and census data. And we find that when we take it into the community in focus groups, we get another layer of knowledge and another layer of experience, which has really changed some of our models quite dramatically. So I think it's exciting that you're thinking of doing that. We found that input has been hugely valuable to building trust in the work, but also to improving the quality of our outputs by actually getting the experience of people who are coping with things in a variety of ways. But your last comments also lead to another question. What would you see as policy changes? You started along this path, but as policy changes to minimize the energy equity gap. It seems we have lead, solar, wall storage, et cetera, that are essentially individual endpoint incentives. What would be next from your perspective?
So to minimize the energy equity gap, I really do believe that we need like a baseline for, okay, within this region, this is the amount of energy that we would expect you to be using to be cooling your home. And if you're not, you know, at that level, or if, you know, if we're looking at like the higher income groups and you're kind of like widening yourself from there, we need to figure out like, how can we send you more energy so that you are able to have that comfortable indoor temperature. And so that's why I do believe that demand response could be a policy change. Now, one of the things with some of the, like the lead, the V2G, the solar, the self-storage that this person mentioned, you know, those require infrastructure changes to the home, right? And renters just will not do that, right? Like I know when I was a student, right, I was not changing anything in that home, right? Because I wasn't planning on being there for that long. And, you know, in the lower income groups, you know, if they're on the verge of just trying to make sure that their utility bills don't get cut off, right? And they maybe don't qualify for as many of those rebates or that lower rate or, you know, the subsidies, they're not going to be thinking about changing the infrastructure in their home, especially if they're a renter. So I do think that we need to have some policies that are really focused on like people that cannot change their own infrastructure, right? And so then it's about trying to incentivize landlords to change over that infrastructure, and then having whatever infrastructure you install be able to be adapted based on like what that person wants to sign up for, right? Because if I'm a renter, I also don't want to be locked into some policy because the person before me got me locked into that policy, right? And that also has to do with like building trust, right? And like actually letting people know like, hey, this is what these are your options, this is what you sign up for, and giving them the option to choose. So I think that the biggest policy change I would say is that we need more flexible policies, because, you know, once you have a solar panel on your home, you pretty much have it there. And I think that also some people who have been like renting out their roofs, right, that is really challenging, because if you want to sell your home, the company still technically like owns the roof, you have to pay them for it. My dad signed up for one of these policies and I was like, Dad, I don't know if you should have like, you know, sold your roof, because like, what if you want to sell the house, right? And so there's like these challenges of like, well, what if the person who's buying the house doesn't want the solar panels on the roof, or they don't want some company to own their roof? And so that's like another big challenge with these infrastructure-based policies.
And you raise a really, I think, important question generally for our country, which is it's very difficult for some communities, maybe all communities, to really understand sectors like energy or water or healthcare. And so people are often just sort of overwhelmed by the challenges of figuring out what is their best strategy forward, what should they really be supporting, what is in their best interest. And we find that makes at least some people, if you think about healthcare, sort of pretty risk averse, and they're worried about contact with the system because they don't feel that they understand it well enough to, you know, really be able to promote their best interests in it. And so there seems to be lots of room in complicated areas like this for more concise, you know, user-friendly and trusted information. And I think, and the sort of work that you're doing sort of seems to lend itself to that. It has that accessibility, which I think is really important. Another question that's come up: do time of use rates increase the energy equity gap compared to flat rates?
So we haven't specifically investigated that question. Now, from our analysis and just working with this data, I would expect them to. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that all of this was done pre-COVID, like on pre-COVID data. And so what we have actually expected to happen is that the energy equity gap is going to widen a lot more while people are stuck at home during the hottest times of the day, especially in the summer. And, you know, that time of use rate that would have been encouraging you to like reduce those peak demands, you could, you know, in theory, like shift your dishwasher if you wanted to, like to off that time of use. But we know that those appliances typically aren't in low income households. So then like it's one more thing that you have to remember to do manually. So like the, you know, the less automated the switching is, the less likely you are to do it, because it's just one more thing that you have to think about. And then with COVID, I mean, with families being stuck at home a lot more often, we have in our data set, we know that the lower income groups typically have larger household family sizes. And so then we would expect there to be more kids in the home, especially with the school closures. And the other challenge is that, you know, our energy equity gap only looked at the point at which you turn on your air conditioning unit. So now we're actually looking at the slopes of the different curves between the income groups. And we have seen much flatter curves in the lower income groups as compared to the higher income groups, even when we're looking at like energy usage per square foot of the home. And one reason for that is, on average, I think the lower income groups have like 1.8 air conditioning units in their home, and the higher income groups have about 3.6 on average air conditioning units in their home. So that just represents like the inability to adapt to climate change, because again, you don't have that infrastructure. But specifically to answer your question, you got to watch me because I can ramble, is we have not specifically looked at time of use rates and how they compare to flat rates within our analysis.
Well, you're not rambling at all. I think that you're very, very, and you just raised an important question, and that is, you know, what was the impact of COVID-19 on the energy equity gap? Because on the one hand, people were stuck at home. On the other hand, a lot of more disadvantaged people were forced to continue to more or less work as they were. So work from home was probably biased significantly towards people who have more capacity. So I don't know. So it would be really interesting to unravel that and figure out what do we learn about vulnerability and inequity from this experience, and what might that mean, since very likely we're going to have other periods of time when we have these enormous shocks, ecological or health shocks to our country. So are you planning to continue along this trajectory with more years?
That's what we're hoping to do. So again, data is gold here, and especially in this type of analysis. So it really depends on if the utility company is willing to share all of the COVID data. So far, they've only shared 2 months worth of data, which isn't exactly enough to calculate the energy equity gap, because we actually do need to see changes across the temperatures. And so they've actually shared with us the March and April data during the stay-at-home mandates. And so what we did was we saw sharp increases across all income groups. And it actually made it very hard to find that minimum point now, because the March and April timeframe is when people would, in theory, start to turn on their air conditioning units. And so that's actually when everybody just got dropped off at home or got forced to stay home. And so one of the things that we have noticed is that the degree change was greatest in the lower income groups. And we do suspect that that is because of the stay-at-home measure with their kids being at home. So even if they were forced to go into work, their kids were not forced to go into school, actually made to stay at home from school. And so that also represents a big challenge for trying to dissect, the energy equity implications of COVID, especially given that, we're not able to ask the home, hey, how many of you had to actually go to work, right? And how many of you actually had to stay home? So we did deploy a survey to ask people how they've been impacted by COVID, just asking people do you feel like you're using more energy in your home or less energy during COVID? Did you have a job change in terms of your income level during COVID? And we did see that there was a huge increase, of course, in our lowest income group. So people that moved from this 4 to 2 to 4 groups got dropped down to that unemployment group. And so that is also another thing that we are looking at, because that is also going to impact whether or not people are willing to increase their energy consumption during COVID as well.
Destiny, I think that we could probably have another hour of discussion about how the fact that you're a professor of engineering and public policy, I think, is fantastic, and how the world of engineering can have a larger voice in public policy, I think is a hugely important question, one that we take really seriously here in our Solutions that Scale program. But we have run out of time, and I want to, on behalf of Solutions that Scale and UCI and all of the people who attended today, I want to thank you very much for a really fascinating presentation on what is clearly a hugely important and really contemporarily relevant and exciting area of research. So thanks so much for agreeing to share your work even before it's published. It's fascinating. I hope that we'll find ways for you to interact with us going forward, because I think there's lots of overlap between what we're doing at UCI on climate change and energy and the transition to a net zero economy and what you're interested in doing. But on behalf of everybody, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for coming, and thank you for having me.
And I hope everybody will look forward to our next seminar.